Welcome to Crafting the iOS Deployment Experience. What we're going to be talking about today is getting new technology should be fun. But if you don't plan for a proper deployment of iOS, things can go wrong and it kind of detracts from the experience that we're trying to create. So my name is Sam Weiss. I'm an evangelist for Apple education here at Jamf. And what I focus on is creating the best possible experience for students, teachers, and administrators when it comes to iOS devices. And I'm joined by Mark.
Hey everyone, this is Mark Buffington. I'm a systems engineer here at Jamf. I work with a variety of organizations, really on the technical side of things. Like to help out, make sure you're getting good workflows and good success for the folks that you support.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. So just to give everyone an overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to give you a real quick overview of who and what is Jamf. But then we're going to dive right into the fun stuff. So how do you plan for success for your day one-to-one deployments? And you're going to see this from a few different perspectives. I'm going to step you through the student perspective, which includes unboxing, enrolling these devices, and getting excited about the possibilities of technology in the classroom. And then we're going to break that down and show you exactly how we built that experience. But by moving backwards, we started with the student experience that we wanted, and we built policies and configuration profiles and workflows within Jamf Pro to support that. At the end, we're going to wrap up with some next steps, and like I mentioned before, plenty of time for Q&A, so keep those questions coming. And just to start off, just a very quick overview of who and what is Jamf. Jamf is an organization of almost 800 employees who wake up every day, and our one and only goal is to help organizations succeed with Apple. And that means more than just push settings and apps to devices. What we're talking about is true lifecycle management to simplify the life for IT, students, and administrators. And Jamf has two different products for managing Apple devices, but today we're going to focus specifically on Jamf Pro. Jamf Pro is a tool for Apple management IT pros. This tool is generally used by IT departments, like I said, for that full lifecycle management of Apple devices. So we're talking about how do you go from a pallet of shrink-wrapped iPads showing up at your delivery dock to be in hands with students. And we do that through device configuration, app management, pulling extensive inventory that we can actually action and automate, as well as providing the security controls that parents and administrators need on these devices to feel comfortable with them in an IT setting, as well as providing on-demand resources. So how do you make students, faculty, and administrators self-sufficient when it comes to their technology to allow IT to focus on bigger picture items? Now, Jamf Pro is a web-based application, can be accessed and managed from any modern web browser. And today, Jamf is happy to help more than 15,000 organizations manage over 10 million Apple devices worldwide. And when we dive into those numbers, what we see is there's a lot of schools. We've got 5,000 K-12 schools globally using our solution to empower 7 million teacher and student devices. And one of the reasons that schools trust us is because we offer a history of day zero support. And this is critical for education. If you think about Apple releases as a tick and then a tock, you've got the spring release. And the spring release, I think best characterized by iOS 9.3, has a lot of really exciting features that schools want to take advantage of. And it comes out slightly before the summer. And then later in the fall, you have a major update. So between those two updates, schools either need a way to manage the features that come out in those updates or block those updates entirely, and Jamf offers solutions on both sides. Now, when we talk about technology choice in education, we realize that there's a wide gamut of devices that may fall under your purview, whether that's smart boards, digital signage, laptops, or tablets. But here at Jamf, we focus specifically on Apple devices to provide that best-of-class experience, both before and after it hits student hands. And at Jamf, we truly believe that if you stack it up, an iPad offers a more elevated learning experience than devices that were created simply for browsing and for word processing activities. The iPad, with its full spectrum of apps, accessibility features, and ease of management, make it a fantastic education tool. And the App Store offers this wide range of software that makes it simple to digitally create on, collaborate with. and view the world from different perspectives with augmented reality. So when we think about the classroom of the future, we think about customized technology that enables these new customized experiences. But it all comes back to the management of these devices. Because if you decide to go into iPad deployment without a plan and without a management solution, you're not going to be able to deploy and manage these devices, which means you won't be able to customize them and get the most out of your investment. And teachers are going to have to manage devices in the classroom, and they will find a way to do it, whether that's consumer restriction features, the triple tap on the home button to lock inside apps, using a lot of consumer features where there are better scalable education ways to accomplish that. If you don't provide that management structure, teachers will likely bypass IT policies and purchase apps on their own. They could go out and create Apple IDs on their own. And this is going to lead to a lot of issues. For example, security and privacy concerns if these apps aren't complying with security policies that your district or your school enforces. In addition, you're going to end up with iPads that are locked in activation lock to these teachers' consumer Apple IDs. So there's a lot of issues if you decide not to manage your devices. And all of these problems will exist if you have 5, 10, or 20 devices. But the moment you start talking about iPads at scale, these problems just increase. So when we talk about apps, what is your deployment strategy and your purchase strategy? Which departments will be funding VPP credit? Do you have an Apple ID strategy? Can you get by without an Apple ID? When talking through the full life cycle of the content that needs to get to these devices, you need to consider things like, will we be using anything from the iBook store? Will we be using shared iPad where we need to create managed Apple IDs? And beyond that, you're going to have to think about updates. So not just for iOS, but also the apps. And like I mentioned before, are you going to force updates as soon as they come out? Or are you going to block updates? And the same is true with apps, especially when it comes to standardized testing apps that you need to vet against your network, iOS, as well as server-side applications. And lastly, classroom management. Apple offers a lot of control for teachers in the classroom without having to get into the muddy waters of mobile device management. But that needs to be a conversation that's had with instructional designers, directors of curriculum, as well as instructional technologists that will teach out the applications of this technology. So, like I mentioned, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, but fortunately, Apple has a framework to solve for a lot of this, and it's called mobile device management, and that is what Jamf does. So mobile device management gives us a tool to deploy devices, inventory devices, push specific settings, management commands, and do a whole lot more with these devices. So all of that brings us to today, rollout day. So what we want to show you is how you can deliver an amazing one-to-one deployment experience. And like I mentioned, when students receive their technology, it should be an exciting time. And for you to pull this off properly, it's going to take a lot of planning, a great management tool like Jamf, and a few tips and tricks that we're going to talk about today that should make sure everything goes smoothly for you. All right. So when we dive into what does it take to do a one-to-one deployment properly, the best thing I can tell you is communication. A few examples of important communication that we sometimes see missed when planning these deployments. One is a letter home to the parents. This should explain why the school chose to do a one-to-one program, what the educational outcomes of that program are expected to be, and why the iPad was chosen. A quick explanation of the management capabilities that you have with Jamf should go home to parents, because what you can manage and see, as well as what you can't manage and see, are important to parents. In my opinion, Apple developed a very non-intrusive management framework that students and parents should feel comfortable bringing into their homes. And while most schools have an acceptable use policy for technology, the iPad is a special tool that may need some specific language around how it's expected to be used, especially if you do give students the ability to use it for both school as well as entertainment. And lastly, community involvement is very important when it comes to a new one-to-one deployment. Things that I would recommend: work with your school liaison officer or the local police department to give them a crash course on your capabilities with lost mode, activation lock, and the DEP process. We've seen a lot of success when schools and districts partner with local pawn shops to explain to them how can you easily identify if an iPad is enrolled in our management solution and how can you get it back to us. Now, a link that I'm going to refer to several times in this presentation is jamf.it/one-to-one. There we do have an example acceptable use policy that you can tweak and use for your purposes. All right. And as we get to the student experience that we're trying to create, just a few themes that we really want to drive home. One is this should be student-led versus IT-driven. So when students are involved in the setup process of their device, they feel more ownership and more responsibility for it. And students that are more responsible with their devices tend to treat them better, leading to lower breakage rates. In addition, this builds a level of trust with IT when students are involved and they see the setup process. But let's be honest, this is also for you. You really shouldn't be doing any of this by hand using new modern workflows. And speaking of modern workflows, we'd encourage you to do as much of this over the air as possible versus using sync carts or configurator stations, which definitely do have their use cases, but I would say the majority of schools should be able to get by with over-the-air wireless workflows. Additionally, we want to make sure that we have the majority of our resources available on demand instead of forced. And this is for a few reasons. This not only creates self-sufficient users, but gives us speed benefits that Mark is going to talk about later on. And lastly, like I mentioned, Apple offers some amazing classroom management capabilities, but it's really important to communicate that to students so that they know exactly what their teachers have the ability to see and not see. Which all brings us to the gymnasium. Now, you can do an iPad deployment wherever you'd like, but we just want to give a quick shout out to North Raleigh Christian Academy, who did a webinar with us back in the day. And this was the model that they used to distribute over 1,000 iPads to students in grades 4 through 12. So we're going to take this model of 7 different stations, and we're going to break that down into a very easy to go through process for students. We have the Get Started station, and we're going to go into all of these stations specifically in just a bit. But we've got the Get Started station, the Student ID station, a Forum station where students will fill out their acceptable use policy, the iPad Pickup station where a lot of the magic happens, a large app delivery station, a spot to check out self-service and learn about Classroom, and finally a place to verify and check out once you're done with that deployment. So let's go through that student perspective. The Get Started station is a time for you to set proper expectations for students for what happens first, next, and last. As you can see on the screen, we highly recommend having an iPad handout passport or a similar checklist for students to do a few things. One, they need to know the process. Setting students' expectations for what's the next station that I go to, make sure that they're not jumping ahead, maybe tapping buttons that they shouldn't. Additionally, this gives you a place for students to self-report the condition of their equipment. And when it comes time to assess damage costs later on, or go back to verify that we did actually provide you a charging brick in a case, this is a great way to do that. This is another one of those resources that you'll find at jamf.it/one-to-one. Another concept that we highly recommend and we've seen work well in practice is this concept of a bus driver. So if you have a group of 5 or 6 students that are going through this, dedicating one person to step them through every station maintains consistency of who those students are working with and leads to a very smooth process. The Student ID station. Now, this is a critical component for some workflows that Mark's going to talk about later, but it can be very beneficial for students to be able to authenticate on their iPad against an Active Directory or other LDAP account. For reasons that Mark will get into later, this is going to help scope both apps as well as restrictions to students to make sure that students in particular grades are getting age-appropriate restrictions. Now, you'll need to work with your student services or your Active Directory team to make sure that this is ready to go on day one. The Forum station. This is a great time to collect those acceptable use agreements. Again, this is available at jamf.it/one-to-one. But before students actually touch a piece of technology, you should make sure that this is taken care of. We really don't like to think about these things, but if a student were to drop an iPad the moment that you hand it into them, unfortunately there has to be a paper trail on what is the expectation on the responsibilities. Is that on the student or is that on the district? Just much easier not to have an awkward conversation later on and just get this done quickly. All right. So like I said, this is the fun station. At the iPad pickup station, it can literally be as easy as opening the box, powering on the iPad, and there is no step 3. This is the zero-touch deployment mantra that Jamf has been preaching for quite a while. And here is how it looks like in practical use in an iPad one-to-one deployment. So at this iPad pickup station, not only are they going to get their iPads, but you can hand out their charging bricks, cables, and your cases. We highly recommend having a sitting area for this process, as this is the step that could take the longest. And if things are going to go wrong, this is where they're going to go wrong. So have a comfortable place for people to hang out. We also highly recommend that this is almost 2 separate stations, your pickup station and then the seating area. And then there should be a supervisor that dictates traffic flow for the rest of this experience. If you start getting a bottleneck in this area, it's going to throw your whole day off. So you should have someone, think about a Genius bar, where someone is supporting one-to-many. Someone just floating around making sure that students are making their way through this process. As soon as there's free spaces, the supervisor should signal to Station 1 that they can let more students through. Now, I'm about to play you a video on the right side on that iPad, but it goes really quickly. So I just want to tell you what you're going to see. When this iPad powers on and connects to network for the first time, it's going to go through this DEP enrollment, which is a forced enrollment. You have no choice. You have to go through it. This device is going to get baseline configuration profiles and baseline apps, and the background is going to set unique per grade. This is just a very easy identifier for students, teachers, and faculty to look at a device and know, is this 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, just based on the background. So here we go. So like I said, this goes very fast. You choose your country, your language, your network. As soon as you get an IP address, Jamf is going to start enrolling your device. You notice we've skipped a lot of setup screens to help keep this process smooth and streamlined. Our configuration profiles are coming down right away. One we've chosen for this device is we're going to require a passcode. And you'll notice apps are starting to install themselves in the background. Again, we encourage keeping this small so that it can be done quickly without saturating your network. And that's it.
All right, so this is Mark here. Happy to join in on this process. From a tech side of things, there's some other tips and tricks you might consider for this pickup station just to make sure that you don't run into any slowdowns. For one, have extra power available. Oftentimes, even with quick, fast charging USB-C chargers, you can get a little extra power more quickly. But then there comes to be a consideration and planning about what network these devices are going to connect to. And it's really a best practice to do kind of an audit before this process to consider how many simultaneous devices can connect to my Wi-Fi access points nearby. Do I need to supplement that? Do I need extra access points to be in the area as well? So doing a pre-check audit really is critical to know that your network can handle this number of connections at once, just so you don't run through any slowdowns. Additionally, when it comes to app and content delivery, use the content caching service in macOS. Starting in High Sierra, that caching service is native to macOS. So simply any Mac that is on the same network as the iPads can function as that content caching service. Simply downloading the app once from the internet and Apple servers, and then every subsequent time after that when devices request it, they're going to be getting that cached content much quicker, less time of data traveling on your network.
Great, thanks, Mark.
And Beyond that, maybe if your network can't handle that, or if you perhaps don't have the resources to add extra access points, consider other options for large app delivery and a physical wired connection. So that same content caching service as you see on the screen here in System Preferences, that can also provide tethered functionality with USB to Lightning cables. And that can provide that network connection to the devices natively. So they can be grabbing that content that's cached locally on that Mac and have that delivered over a wired connection to the devices much quicker.
And times that's really useful, Mark. We've seen GarageBand, iMovie, Pages Keynote Numbers, just fairly large apps that everyone will be getting. And if students are taking these devices home and they have broadband at home, that's fine. They can get this content there. But for students that do not have internet or have satellite internet or just slow internet, this is a really great option for them to quickly get those devices and become productive. Now, this next station is more of an awareness station. Like I said, we want students to be self-sufficient. We want them to be able to discover content on their own, and that's where Jamf's self-service app comes in. So this is a curated app store, which can either augment or simply replace the App Store if you do not want anyone to have access to that. And it's only going to show pre-approved content as well as settings that students can scope to themselves, whether that's setting up email, VPN, or printers automatically. So that's a great tool that you just want students to have an awareness of, and stepping them through it, having them download their first app or ebook from there will help them become aware of it. And then lastly, the Apple Classroom Station. Like I mentioned, this is, in my opinion, one of Apple's greatest features for the classroom and for teachers. But it's really important, going back to that communication aspect, to make students aware of what can my teacher do so that they feel comfortable with this device. And lastly, when you get to the last station, that should really be verifying that this device is enrolled. And that can be done one of a few ways: a quick check in Jamf Pro or a check in the Settings app on the iPad. We also want to make sure that students have actually filled out that form along with conditions. And when this form is done, it can either be collected by IT or it can be sent back with the homeroom teacher to be held on until the end of the year.
All right, so now moving on to the IT perspective, we want to take a look how these things are set up on the back end. So taking a look, starting off with provisioning, how are these devices going to get connected, get the content, get the settings they need? And some of that really backs up to Apple's frameworks for MDM itself. So Apple's push notification service, which all Apple devices are always reaching out to receive push messages. Those messages can be sent from Jamf Pro, making that device check in on command and receive different commands, apps, and profiles to those devices. And simply, that is what is the basis for Apple's MDM framework. When it comes to iOS deployment options, there's a few different choices that you can do. Apple Configurator can work for enrolling, user-initiated enrollment profiles. But the focus here today, especially in this one-to-one personalized deployment, is on the device enrollment program. Beyond the device enrollment program, maybe you don't have devices that are in it, and that may not be a problem anymore. So starting with iOS 11, Apple added the concept for provisional DEP enrollment. And with this, you can add devices that previously were not purchased through the proper channels to be part of DEP, and then use Configurator really just one last time to get them added to your device enrollment program and Apple School Manager instance, and then go through a DEP enrollment. And that's a very important step there, using Configurator to add, but then you'll want to have them enroll using that standard Jamf Pro pre-stage enrollment with DEP, so you can get added capabilities such as restricting the ability to remove the MDM profile. It's also important to note that this process has a 30-day window where that management on the iPad can be removed through the Settings app. So really it's best practice to start early, have this process done during the summertime, maybe when you don't have students in class, to have that prepared. Also, just to make note, we do have a Jamf knowledge base video. You can find it on Jamf Nation or through this shortened URL that walks through this process of doing configurator to add to DEP, then enroll with a pre-stage. So taking a look at that pre-stage enrollment, this screen may be familiar to some of you, but really this is where you define how that device is going to behave when it goes through the activation process. Whatever you define here is going to synchronize to Apple's activation servers and get pulled down to the iPad when it first turns on. Organizational information, kind of the base framework. Here on this screen, you can see requiring credentials for enrollment. And you can customize this message, and this is very important if you have a directory service connected with Jamf Pro. You can have that user sign in with a known login, and that's going to personalize who is using the device without any additional actions after enrollment to associate the device. A variety of other setup assistance screens can be skipped. As Sam mentioned earlier, this can vastly streamline that process. So let's take a look at device management. What are we putting on these devices? What sort of options do we have? At the heart of most of these is configuration profiles. This is that basic framework for delivering settings payloads. It could be something from a passcode, networking, accounts, and really especially important for a lot of schools are your internet and networking settings. How are you going to have it configured to work on your network? Are you using any HTTP proxies, content filters? And is this device going to be able to work the same whether it's on your school's network or at home? Those things can be deployed using those configuration profiles. So let's take a look at a few specific profiles here. And granted, there's many different ones that you may choose to customize, but we'll highlight a few of them here. One that I really feel is an important one, especially when you have devices in a case, which is going to be, say, blocking the serial number on the back, is to have a lock screen message. This is something that you can have customized. And the great thing here is that, as you might be able to see on the screen here, there's a couple variables, those $, full name, device name. And those variables are supported within Jamf Pro. So the name of the student that's using the device, that name can be dynamically pulled and displayed on each device on its own, as well as additional things like serial number, asset tags, information as well. So the benefit there is if anyone picks up and finds a device, they don't need to know the passcode. They don't need to remove it from the case. They can simply see whose device it is and get it back where it needs to go. Other customizations you might consider. We often hear people want to have customized home screen layouts. And this is something that, while you can do it, I would caution you on choosing to do this for a one-to-one deployment. With the home screen layout, it is going to be very firm and a rigid profile, meaning that once it's deployed, a user cannot change the order of those icons in the apps. And also, if you are allowing a user to get more content on demand or allowing App Store usage, this is something that any new app is simply just going to add itself to the end of the list of apps alphabetically. And that's not the best user experience. But where you might consider this is if you work with your instructional designer and if you have a very simplified student experience that you're looking with maybe just a handful of applications that would stay the same through the year, then you may consider this. Speaking of apps and whether you allow App Store or not, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this. Here on this screen, this is showing the assumption that a user may have access to the App Store and get content on their own, but you can restrict specific apps if you don't want them to be on devices. There's a number of ways that this can be approached as well. Some schools don't want to be heavy-handed in this way, but instead may want to use the power of inventory to see if one of these unapproved apps is on the devices. They can add those devices to a smart group and use that to take action, some sort of action to talk about your school's acceptable use policy. So, speaking of inventory, there's really a number of ways that can be looked at to automate certain actions, as well as just report and view things. So as we look here, we can see a lot of hardware information is gathered, software information, the management status, what its passcode, encryption status might be. And really, we gather a wealth of data that the devices supply to Jamf Pro. Every single bit of inventory that's gathered can be used for either custom reporting or to take actions with smart groups. When it comes to deciding how content gets delivered and to who it gets delivered, well, you can absolutely use groups that are based off of, for example, a directory service group, something that shows what grade someone is in, class, for example. There's a number of different groupings that can be done within Jamf Pro as well. I'll highlight a couple here briefly: static groups and smart groups. Static groups, as you might expect, they stay the same. You manually define which devices are in them. And then that group can be used for your scope, your target for certain profiles and actions. But then when you want to automate things, that's where smart groups come in to take action based off of statuses. So here, looking at devices with a certain amount of storage and certain OS versions, you might be looking at that even before deciding a large app to deploy. Do they have enough space on that device to deploy that app? So these groups, you can take a variety of different actions. And I'll highlight just a brief look at creating a smart group because it can get very granular. So in this one, similar to the example of having a action take place for different grades, having different wallpapers, we're going to look at creating a smart group for third grade. With my criteria here, I'm actually looking at something that's not exactly even a device criteria. This is looking at the criteria of position. So assuming you have a directory service connected to Jamf Pro, that known user, that user's data is going to be synchronized over. And this is simply looking at that field that I've mapped to my directory. And it's going to see that the value of that is grade 3. And then I can take action. So if I save this group, I could have it be the target for different profiles and apps, but I can also do management actions like setting wallpaper. This can be set to do either the lock screen, home screen, or both. And then optionally, if you want that image to stay persistent through the entire school year, you can also apply a restriction configuration profile that disallows the changing of the wallpaper. Taking a look at security and compliance, there's a lot of security functions that are built into iOS. So as a platform, it's going to be hardware encrypted when you have a passcode. But there's a number of things that you can also do to secure your network connections. Apply your VPNs, make it either a per app if you want to keep certain application data private. On the flip side, and I know this is of interest to many organizations, you can also restrict students from adding their own VPN clients as well through settings also. And then native functions like Touch ID can vastly improve that end user experience instead of using the passcode every time. Looking at a few remote management commands that can be of use for security, locking, wiping, renaming a device as needed, clearing passcodes, restrictions, and iOS versioning. There's a lot of management controls that can be done there. There's been, for a couple years now, the ability to apply iOS updates, but recently with the additional features of iOS 11.3 and greater, you can also, on the flip side, restrict the ability to update the iOS version for up to 90 days. So that way you can test with a new iOS version against your applications you use, your environment, before you allow that to be rolled out to student devices. And then other functions, if you need to unmanage a device, if students are able to keep the devices after they are finished with school, you can unmanage, maybe remove it from your Apple School Manager instance. But also if that device is being turned in, you're going to have an activation lock bypass code. If they were allowed to use iCloud and Find My iPad, that supervised capability where the device sends activation lock bypass to Jamf Pro is very important to make it easier to deprovision that device. Some of those commands can be seen here in the inventory record, and it's also worth noting that most all of these are also available through mass actions. Taking a quick look at software and patching, let's take a look at app deployments. A variety of things available here on the App Store for organizations to purchase through the Apps and Books feature of Apple School Manager, previously referred to as the Volume Purchase Program. And custom apps also available, may be available if you're working with a developer that has apps that aren't on the App Store natively. And that delivery through the Volume Purchase Program allows you to do that without using Apple IDs at all. And when you do deliver an app through VPP, that app is going to be managed, which provides additional controls for MDM and management specific to that application, both for its networking capabilities as well as where it can back up data, etc. So taking a quick look at apps, deploying them, since we integrate with the App Store, we can pull in that version bundle ID information. You would simply choose how you want to distribute it. Install it automatically or prompt the users to install. And then what other restrictions you might want to have since it is going to be a managed app. Do you want it to update automatically? Do you want to do it manually, force the update, or do you want these settings to be global? Along with all content and settings within Jamf Pro, you get a very granular control of who gets what. Here, the Scope tab, which may be familiar, can either be broad to all devices and users or very narrow to specific targeted groups. When you're deploying with the Volume Purchase Program, be sure to check that box to make it to go without the need of the Apple ID, and it will make that process much smoother. Finally, speaking of users, let's take a look at how we can enable them to get resources on their own without having to do an IT request. So self-service is used to is your end-user portal populated by IT for your custom resources that users can get with just one tap. Variety of different things can be used for self-service. Certainly some of these features are similar with our Mac OS management and iOS. But really, it's about getting apps, profiles, ebooks, PDFs. Those items can all be available for users in that self-service portal in a customized manner. And similar with the apps to deploy, if you are putting them in self-service, it is going to look very similar to the automatic installation, but you're also going to get the ability to customize what a user sees. By default, we pull in data from the App Store from what the vendor and the app developer has, but you can change it, make it custom, use Markdown language to add bullet points, bold, italics. That can all be customized to give some context of why a user may want to install a certain app you have available for them.
Great. Thanks, Mark. So just to recap, because we've actually seen quite a bit today, if you're looking to provide a positive, fun, effective one-to-one rollout, it requires a few things. Firstly, focus on the experience that you want students to go through and work backwards from that to the technology. Communicate, over-communicate to teachers, to parents, to the community to make sure that everyone's ready for this rollout. Just to recap, what we've talked about today is Jamf Pro and its ability to provide that lifecycle management, to provide that zero IT touch deployment methodology to your students and your schools. Few resources that we specifically want to make sure that you're aware of, jamf.it/121. I've seen a few of you have downloaded this already, but what you will see in there is a technical companion guide. So you can hand this right to if you are the IT person, you can follow it. If you're not, you can hand it directly to them. And this will show how to build this experience that we've talked about today. We have our acceptable use policy example in there, as well as the iPad handout passport. If this type of webinar interests you, I'd highly encourage you to check out Clover School District's Pains and Possibilities of a One-to-One Deployment. They go into a lot of detail on small things that have saved them hours from their massive deployment as well. If you're not a part of Jamf Nation, please join our community. It's a great place to ask questions, get best practices from Mac admins that live your life. You can go and, in fact, I think it's probably about time that we start a thread. What are your best practices for an iPad one-to-one rollout as we're getting close to that time? And Jamf also has a lot of resources to help you out as well, whether that's training or support or pro services. Jamf has actually been boots on the ground for many iPad one-to-one rollouts. So if that's something that your district needs to be successful, we're here for you. In terms of next steps, I'd encourage you to contact us to get started if you're not working with Jamf already. If you'd like to engage with me, I'm active on Twitter, Jamf_Sam. Happy to connect with you there as well. Again, Jamf Nation is a fantastic resource for these types of conversations. And with that, Mark and I want to say thank you. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you found some nugget today that you can take back and smooth out your deployment. Or if this is a new concept for you, hopefully it gets you started on the right foot. So with that, thank you for attending, and we hope you all have a fantastic day.